there were a lot of people who had a motive to attack and ultimately kill Teresa Keel.
It's so sad that she's gone, and justice has to be served. I mean, there's so much hurt.
Loved ones and supporters in court describing Mrs. Keel as a devoted educator, an assistant principal and teacher for decades in the Malvern School District.
This wouldn't be anything she wouldn't give to her students, her colleagues, her family. You know, I worked across the hall for 30.
You know, every so often a story comes along that shakes an entire community to its core. It's the kind of story that doesn't just make the news, it leaves a permanent scar. This is one of those stories. It's the story of Teresa, a young, kind, and vibrant girl whose life was stolen far too soon, and the shocking betrayal that followed. Teresa was the kind of person everyone liked to be around. She had that calm, gentle smile that made people feel safe. The kind of warmth that made even bad days feel a little better. Her friends described her as sweet, thoughtful, and a bit shy, but always dependable. She wasn't chasing fame or attention. She just wanted a normal, happy life. She grew up in Nassau County, in a quiet neighborhood where people knew each other by name. It was the kind of place where kids played outside until sunset, and everyone believed nothing truly terrible could happen there. But sometimes, evil hides in plain sight. Right next door, behind a friendly smile, or sitting across the classroom. Teresa's days were filled with ordinary teenage routines, school, homework, family dinners, late-night calls with friends about nothing and everything. She had dreams, small but bright ones. Maybe go to college, maybe travel one day. She had no idea that her kindness, her trusting heart, would one day put her in the path of something truly horrifying. And that's where Ralph comes in. Ralph was a familiar face around the area, charismatic, funny when he wanted to be, but with a temper that could flip in seconds. He wasn't the type to blend into the background. He liked control. People noticed that about him, even if they couldn't always put their finger on what felt off. He met Teresa through mutual friends. At first, it seemed innocent, just a guy being friendly, maybe a little flirty, but those who knew him well saw signs of obsession growing. Ralph wasn't just interested in Teresa, he was consumed by her. And when she didn't respond the way he wanted, that's when his darker side began to show. At first, it was small things, uninvited messages, unexpected appearances. Teresa, being kind and polite, didn't want to be rude. She brushed it off, thinking it would stop. But obsession never stops on its own. It festers, it feeds on silence, until it becomes something monstrous. Meanwhile, Francesca, Ralph's partner, started noticing changes too. She wasn't blind to what was happening. She saw Ralph's attention shifting, his behavior becoming erratic. But instead of confronting the truth, she chose to ignore it. Maybe she thought it was harmless, maybe she was afraid of losing him, or maybe, deep down, she was afraid of him too. The tension around them was invisible but heavy. Friends noticed, neighbors felt it, that uneasy sense that something wasn't right. Yet nobody could have imagined how far Ralph's obsession would go. Then came the night Teresa didn't come home. It started like any other evening. Teresa said goodbye to her family, promising she'd be back soon. She was responsible, cautious, not the kind to disappear without telling anyone. So when hours passed and she didn't return, panic began to set in. Her parents called her phone, no answer. Friends checked their messages, nothing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Police were notified quickly, but in the early hours, they treated it like a possible runaway case. After all, teenagers sometimes disappear for a night. But Teresa's family knew better. She wasn't running away. Something had happened. As the sun rose, the search began. Volunteers, neighbors, police, everyone joined in. Her photo was everywhere. The smiling girl with soft eyes, now missing. The community that once felt safe was now filled with fear. Meanwhile, Ralph and Francesca were acting strangely calm. Too calm. While others were desperately searching, they kept their distance, giving excuses, avoiding questions. It didn't take long before suspicion started to circle back to them. And then, The horror no one was prepared for. A few days later, police found a shallow grave in a wooded area, not far from where Teresa was last seen. It was there that they discovered her, lifeless, bruised, and brutally beaten. The kind of violence that spoke of rage, not impulse. Someone wanted her to suffer. The entire neighborhood fell silent. Grief, disbelief, and anger mixed into something heavy, the kind of pain that leaves you numb. Teresa's parents were broken, their daughter was gone, and the world no longer made sense. But for investigators, grief had to wait. Their job was to find who did this, and fast. The forensic team began combing through the site. Footprints, tire marks, fibers. Every clue mattered. And soon, one name started surfacing again and again: Ralph. It wasn't long before evidence connected him directly to the scene. A witness spotted his car near the woods the night Teresa went missing. Phone records placed him nearby. And when questioned, his story didn't add up. He fumbled, contradicted himself, changed small details, all the classic signs of someone hiding something. When police searched his house, they found something chilling: traces of blood on clothing and, even more disturbingly, items that belonged to Teresa, a bracelet she always wore, a piece of her torn jacket. There was no more doubt. Ralph had been with her that night. But Ralph wasn't alone. Investigators discovered that Francesca had been there too, or at least knew what had happened. Her fingerprints, her messages, her timeline, they all pointed to one conclusion: she was part of it, or at the very least, helped cover it up. And that revelation made the story even darker, because now it wasn't just a murder, it was a betrayal, wrapped in jealousy and manipulation. When the truth finally began to unfold, it painted a horrifying picture. Ralph's obsession had turned deadly. He had convinced Francesca that Teresa was a threat, a rival, an obstacle, someone who needed to be taught a lesson. But what started as twisted jealousy ended in a brutal act of violence. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was deliberate, planned, carried out with cruelty that words can barely describe. The town that once seemed peaceful was now haunted by the thought that something so evil had been living among them, pretending to be ordinary. Parents started locking doors earlier, kids weren't allowed to walk alone anymore, and the trust that once held the community together began to crumble. But even then, the full extent of what happened to Teresa, how she was lured, what she endured, was only beginning to surface. And that is where things get even darker, because behind Ralph's twisted obsession and Francesca's jealousy lies a deeper, colder truth, one that will leave you questioning how far human cruelty can really go. When police arrested Ralph and Francesca, it wasn't some dramatic movie-style chase. It was quiet, almost unsettlingly calm. Ralph didn't resist. He didn't yell. He didn't even look surprised. He just stared blankly as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, like he already knew this moment was coming. Francesca, on the other hand, looked terrified, not of the police, but of Ralph. Her hands trembled as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. But even in that fear, she stayed close to him, like a shadow too scared to break away from the light that was destroying it. Inside the interrogation room, detectives watched Ralph carefully. They'd seen men like him before, confident, manipulative, someone who thought he was smarter than everyone else in the room. He leaned back in his chair, answering questions with half-truths and smirks, pretending not to care. But underneath, the tension was obvious. The lead detective knew exactly how to break him, not through shouting, but through silence. Let him talk. Let him twist his story until it collapses on itself. And that's exactly what happened. At first, Ralph denied everything. He claimed he hadn't seen Teresa that night. Then he changed his story, said she came to see him, but left unharmed. And finally, when the evidence piled up so high he couldn't climb over it. The phone records, the blood, the bracelet. He broke. He didn't confess out of guilt. He confessed out of pride. He wanted to control the story one last time. Ralph described the night in chilling detail, how he'd picked Teresa up under the pretense of talking things out, how Francesca was there, waiting in the car. He told detectives how the conversation turned heated, how anger took over reason. His words were cold, detached. He didn't describe it like a tragedy. He described it like an event. According to him, Teresa made him snap. In his mind, he was the victim, the misunderstood one, pushed too far. But forensic evidence told a different story. It showed a deliberate attack, not an accident. It showed restraint, planning, and cruelty. Teresa hadn't fought back much, meaning she was likely too scared or too injured to even try. And then there was Francesca. When questioned separately, her story was all over the place. One moment she said she didn't know anything. The next she admitted she was there by mistake. But soon, her own guilt began to eat at her. She cried, she begged. She said Ralph forced her to go along. Yet investigators noticed something chilling. Her messages to Ralph before and after the murder. One of them read, "If she comes near you again, I'll help you deal with her." That message turned everything around. It wasn't just Ralph's obsession anymore. It was their shared delusion, a toxic, codependent spiral that ended in violence. When detectives showed her the message, Francesca froze. Her face went pale. And then she whispered, "He said we'd scare her, not kill her." But Teresa never stood a chance. As the investigation unfolded, the community watched in horror. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, neighbors gave interviews, and social media exploded with grief and anger. Everyone wanted to understand. How could two people do something like this? But there's rarely an answer that makes sense. Behind closed doors, Ralph had a history of manipulation. He used charm to control people, guilt to keep them loyal, and fear to make them stay. Francesca was one of his victims long before she became his accomplice. Friends later said she'd changed completely after meeting him. Stopped seeing family, stopped going out, started defending his every action. It was like he rewired her, and that control gave him power. When prosecutors began building their case, they had more than enough evidence: DNA, messages, witness statements, and a confession. But even then, Ralph's behavior in court was disturbing. He smiled. He laughed during testimony. He even winked at reporters once. It was as if he enjoyed the attention. Francesca, in contrast, looked broken, hollow-eyed, lost. Her defense argued that she was emotionally abused, brainwashed by Ralph. Maybe that was true. But the jury couldn't ignore the fact that she still played a part in covering up what they did to Teresa. During the trial, Teresa's parents sat in silence every day, holding hands, listening to every awful detail. Each photo shown, each word spoken, tore open wounds that would never heal. The prosecution painted a clear picture. Ralph's obsession turned violent. Francesca's jealousy fueled it. Together, they plotted revenge on an innocent girl whose only mistake was trusting the wrong person. The defense tried to twist it, claiming it was a crime of passion, a moment of rage. But the evidence was too strong. The verdict was inevitable. When the judge finally read the sentence, life in prison without parole for Ralph and decades behind bars for Francesca, the courtroom fell silent. No cheers, no relief, just quiet tears, because no sentence could bring Teresa back. For her parents, the verdict was justice, but not closure. They said it best outside the courthouse that day. Justice doesn't heal. It only stops the bleeding. After the trial, the story faded from headlines. The reporters left. The cameras stopped rolling. But for those who knew Teresa, her friends, her teachers, her family, life never returned to normal. Her bedroom stayed the same for years. Photos still on the wall, her favorite books still on the shelf. A silent memorial to a life stolen far too early. And Ralph? He vanished into the prison system. Another inmate number, another name forgotten by most. But those who saw him in his first years behind bars said he never showed remorse. He still talked about Teresa as if she belonged to him, even in death. As for Francesca, she reportedly struggled with guilt. Prison staff said she cried at night, replaying that night over and over. But whether that was true regret or just fear of punishment, no one really knows. What we do know is this: evil doesn't always come in the form of monsters lurking in the dark. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor, a friend, a smile that hides a storm. Teresa's story reminds us that trust is powerful and dangerous in the wrong hands. And though justice was served, the loss remains. Because behind every headline, every courtroom verdict, and every name we remember for the wrong reasons, there's a family left to live with the pain forever. When the courtroom doors finally closed, it felt like the end of something, but it wasn't. For Teresa's family, it was only the beginning of a different kind of pain. The kind that doesn't scream anymore, but sits quietly in the corner of every room. Her parents would wake up every morning expecting to hear her footsteps, her laughter drifting down the hall. But the silence that replaced it was deafening. The smallest things, her favorite coffee mug, her half-finished diary, the sweater still hanging behind her door, became ghosts of a life that should have continued. People often think justice brings peace, but justice isn't peace. It's just the last step in a tragedy that never should have happened. In the weeks after the verdict, the town of Nassau County tried to move on. Flowers were left at the site where Teresa was found. Candlelight vigils lit up the streets for nights on end. People who didn't even know her came just to stand in silence, to remind her family they weren't alone. But behind that unity was fear. Because if something like this could happen to Teresa, the kindest girl anyone knew, then it could happen to anyone. Parents started teaching their daughters about warning signs, about how to say no, about never going anywhere alone. It was a lesson no one wanted to give, but now they didn't have a choice. For investigators who worked the case, the images never really left their minds either. Many of them said later it was one of the hardest cases they'd ever handled, not just because of the brutality, but because of the sheer senselessness of it. There was no motive that made sense, no reason that could ever justify the cruelty. Ralph's behavior behind bars only made it worse. According to prison records, he continued to act cold, arrogant, and at times boastful. In letters intercepted by authorities, he wrote about how people will remember my name. He seemed more obsessed with infamy than with guilt. Psychologists who later analyzed his behavior said Ralph displayed traits of narcissistic psychopathy, the kind of person who believes the world revolves around him, who feeds on control and admiration, and who views others as objects in his personal story. For him, Teresa wasn't a person. She was a possession. And when he couldn't have her, he destroyed her. Francesca's path in prison took a very different turn. At first, she refused to talk about the case at all. She shut down during therapy, avoided other inmates, and spent most of her days in isolation. But over time, something changed. She began writing letters, not to Ralph, but to Teresa's family. Letters that were never answered. Letters full of apologies, explanations, and tears. In one of them, she wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to say I'm sorry for being too weak to stop him." But for Teresa's parents, there were no words that could undo what she'd done. They didn't want apologies. They wanted their daughter back. In interviews years later, Teresa's mother spoke softly about the pain of losing her only child. "We raised her to be kind, to trust people, to see the good in everyone. But now, I wish she hadn't trusted so easily." It was a heartbreaking truth, that her greatest strength was also what made her vulnerable. As time passed, the story began to fade from headlines. Other tragedies came and went, but for the people who lived through it, Teresa's memory became something sacred, a reminder of how fragile life really is. At her old school, teachers created a small scholarship fund in her name, the Teresa Hope Foundation, to support students who showed kindness and empathy, just like she did. Every year, a ceremony is held in her honor. Friends still show up, even after all these years. They talk about her laugh, her silly jokes, her big heart. But every year, one sentence echoes louder than the rest. She didn't deserve what happened to her, and she didn't. The deeper you look into Ralph and Francesca's story, the more disturbing it becomes. Because it wasn't just about jealousy or rage, it was about control, dependency, and the dark psychology that binds abusers to their victims. Ralph wasn't insane. He was fully aware of what he was doing. He enjoyed the power. The idea that he could decide who lives, who suffers, who gets remembered. He wanted control over Teresa's story, even after she was gone. Francesca, on the other hand, was trapped in a cycle of emotional abuse. Ralph manipulated her self-worth, convinced her that loyalty meant doing anything for him. Over time, she lost her own identity, until she became a reflection of his cruelty. That's what makes cases like this so chilling. Evil doesn't always start as evil. Sometimes it starts as love, twisted, poisoned, and turned into something unrecognizable. In the years that followed, the story of Teresa became a cautionary tale told in classrooms and community centers. A story about trust, boundaries, and the danger of ignoring red flags. Local organizations even began workshops on toxic relationships, teaching young people how to spot manipulation, coercion, and emotional control before it's too late. Teresa's story, though tragic, began saving others from walking the same path. Her parents found small comfort in that. Not peace, but purpose. They started speaking publicly, visiting schools, sharing Teresa's story, not as a tale of fear, but as a lesson in awareness. They said, if sharing her story saves even one life, then maybe her death won't be in vain. And that's the kind of strength that turns pain into legacy. Even now, decades later, people still leave flowers on her grave. They still talk about her in past tense, but with warmth. She became a symbol of innocence lost, and a reminder that kindness, even in a cruel world, still matters. Meanwhile, Ralph's name slowly disappeared. The world forgot him. The attention he craved vanished. He was just another prisoner, a man who traded freedom for a lifetime of walls and regret. And Francesca, reports say she keeps to herself, avoiding contact, living quietly behind bars. Some say she's changed, some say she hasn't. But the truth is, it doesn't matter anymore. The damage was done. Teresa's story isn't about them. It's about what their darkness tried and failed to erase. Because even after all the pain, Teresa's light never really went out. It lived on through her family, her friends, and everyone who heard her story and chose to be more cautious, more aware, more kind. Evil may win moments, but it never wins the story. Time is strange after tragedy. For some, it moves forward like nothing happened. But for others, like Teresa's family, time stands still. Every day feels the same. Quiet, heavy, and hollow. The world keeps turning, but their world stopped the night she didn't come home. In the years that followed, her story became something larger than a crime report. It became a mirror, a reflection of how easily trust can be broken, how quickly innocence can be stolen, and how fragile human goodness can be in the face of cruelty. People still remember her name, not because of how she died, but because of how she lived. The girl who smiled at everyone. The girl who never spoke ill of anyone. The girl who believed in people, even when she shouldn't have. Her friends often say that Teresa had this quiet magic, the kind of kindness that made you want to be better. And maybe that's why her story refuses to fade away, because it reminds us of something the world seems to forget too often, that being kind is brave, but it's also dangerous in the wrong company. After the trial, one detective who worked the case retired. He said this was the one case that changed how he looked at people forever. "You think you know evil when you see it," he said, "but it wears the same face as everyone else. You can shake its hand and never realize it. And that's the most chilling truth. Evil doesn't arrive wearing a mask or carrying a weapon. It comes disguised as love, as attention, as someone who says all the right things until it doesn't. Ralph was that kind of evil. Francesca, trapped in his shadow, became part of it. And Teresa, she was the light that exposed it. Over time, documentaries, podcasts, and crime channels began covering the case. But for those who lived it, no version ever captured the real weight of it. Because a story like this isn't just about what happened, it's about what it took away. For Teresa's parents, every birthday became a reminder of how many she never got to celebrate. Every sunset, a question: where would she be now? Would she have finished college, fallen in love, had a family of her own? Those questions never find answers. They just linger, quietly, painfully. But despite all that loss, her family chose not to let hate consume them. They refused to let Ralph win by turning them bitter. Instead, they built something good from something awful. Through the Teresa Hope Foundation, they helped fund mental health counseling for young women who survived abusive relationships. They gave scholarships, started awareness workshops, and partnered with local schools to educate teens about healthy relationships and personal safety. They turned pain into prevention, grief into guidance, loss into light. And in that light, Teresa lived on. Years later, when a journalist interviewed Teresa's mother, she said something that silenced the room. "People think we want revenge. We don't. We just want people to understand that monsters don't look like monsters. Sometimes they look like people you love." That one sentence stuck with everyone who heard it. Because it's true. We grow up believing we can sense danger, that evil is obvious, that we'd recognize it if we saw it. But Teresa's story shatters that illusion. She didn't ignore danger. She just never saw it coming. That's what makes her tragedy so haunting. Not because it was rare, but because it was real. Because it could happen to anyone. In the years since, her story has inspired quiet change. Schools now teach students how to recognize manipulation. Support groups help those in controlling relationships find a way out before it's too late. Even law enforcement agencies updated their approach to stalking and harassment cases, giving them the attention they always deserved. It's heartbreaking that it took her death to make those changes. But sometimes, the most painful stories spark the most powerful lessons. And maybe that's what Teresa would have wanted, for her story to help others see what she couldn't. One of her teachers once said, "Teresa didn't have a loud voice, but her silence spoke volumes." Even now, she's teaching us something. Teresa's story isn't one of despair. It's one of strength. Her memory became a shield for others. Her tragedy became a teacher. Her name became a promise that no life, no matter how short, is ever truly forgotten if it leaves the world a little wiser. In the end, it's not about how she died. It's about what her story continues to do. It reminds us that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, that trust should be earned, not given blindly, and that every time someone listens to their instincts, walks away from danger, or speaks up against control, Teresa's spirit is right there, whispering, "You deserve better." As the camera fades, you can almost picture her, standing in a field, bathed in golden light. The wind brushing through her hair, that familiar soft smile on her face. The girl who never made it home, but whose light found a way to reach us all. Because even when darkness wins battles, light always wins the war.